remittances session, harnessing the 1 trillion remittance market to accelerate access to inclusive finance. We still have some people coming in. I'd like to introduce Leon Isaacs of DMA Global, based in London, and John Capel, DMA based in Sydney. And I think I've known both of them for quite a number of years. I don't know of any other people who are more experienced in remittances than the two of you. So I think if you have any questions, they'll be able to answer them for you. So I'm actually going to hand off and let you introduce the session.
Okay, thanks very much, Juanita. I always get worried now when somebody says you're experienced. I think that's just a euphemism for old. And in my case, I'm old, but hopefully have 30 odd years of experience in remittances. So with a bit of luck, I can share that with you. I realise this is the last full session of the day and also the one before the drinks start. So we'll try and make this as interactive as possible. So can I just ask, how many of you here are from a central bank? A few hands. How many from the ADB itself? How many from private sector type of organisations? Quite a lot of hands. That's very interesting. Any from places of learning or academia? Right. Okay, great. You are allowed to put your hands up more than once on that anyway. So I'm here with my colleague Jonathan Capel, who's down here in the front. He's going to back me up whenever I go wrong, and also when you want a slightly different sounding voice, although it will have an English twang to it, he'll also intervene. And over the next hour or so, we're just going to go through a number of key areas around this world of remittances, pretty much in line with what we had broadcast. But I'd like to make it as interactive as possible. So what I'd suggest is that if we've split it into these 4 sections. So the first one's going to look at generally high-level remittances information, some numbers you may be familiar with, some you're not. Then we're going to look at some of the biggest challenges that are out there, particularly around technology and data, and also informal remittances. Then we're going to go on to look at some of the ways that remittances can be leveraged for financial inclusion, and finally talk about the role of regulation and regulators. What I'd suggest is, at any point, if you're not clear or want a further explanation, please just ask. But also, we'll try and stop if you've got opinions or you disagree or whatever. Very happy to have that discussion. So I think we'll see how it goes, and if we've only got to the end of the first section after an hour, we're in trouble, but hopefully that means we've also had a useful discussion. So, any questions so far? No, good, right. So, the first thing I thought we'd do is just do a sort of numbers quiz for all of you. Whilst remittances are all about one person sending money to another person internationally on a regular basis, so it's all about people, everybody's always thirsty for numbers and data in order to be able to make decent decisions. So I'm going to put a number up. John, you're not allowed to enter. Juanita, you can enter if nobody else does. I want somebody to tell me what the number is. So 272 million. What's that, sorry? Correct. That's the latest number from the UN for the number of migrants internationally. So those are the people who are primarily sending money, not the only ones. There's 272 million. To put that into perspective, that would make that the 5th largest country in the world if they were all in one country. So we're talking about a large number of people. 683 billion US dollars. Somebody must know that. No? John? Even you don't know. Yeah, so that's the estimated total value of international remittances sent in 2018, according to the World Bank's NOMAD department. Of that, 526 billion was sent to developing countries, and that's why there's so much interest in this space. $275 billion. What was that, sorry? Did somebody hazard an answer? No, good guess. It's actually the total official remittances to Asia. So 275 billion. The number to India is, I think the last number I saw was 89 billion, but we have a slide with that later, so you can test me. 38.5%. Who wants to have a guess? Are you from Tonga? But you're... Okay, you're 100% right. So that's the percentage of the GDP of Tonga that remittances form, 38.5%. So nearly 2 in every $5 that's earned by the country comes in the form of remittances. So it's pretty critical. 29.9%. Did your session cover that as well? Correct. Philippines is 29.9% is the figure for Nepal for the contribution there. Consistently one of the highest countries for receiving remittances in the world. 6.8%. Anybody know what that is? Very close, or actually correct, depending on your definition of commission. 6.84% is the average cost to send $200 as a remittance, as measured by the Remittance Prices Worldwide website. So one of the things we do as an organisation is collect the data for that site, but it really means that if you're sending $200, you're paying on average $13.60 every time, which is a horrendous price. So I'll just put these three up, because this will give you a clue. Can you hazard a guess of what they might be? 6.6% is the average cost to send to East Asia and the Pacific. 7% is the average cost to send to Central Asia, and 5% is the average cost to send to South Asia. So you can see that actually all the prices to send to Asia are reasonably in line with the global average, except for South Asia, which is the lowest price area in the world. And as we'll see later, although that probably makes some people feel good, there's still some way to go before we can achieve the true potential. So, some of you passed your maths test there, or your numbers test, but we'll go through some of it in a bit more detail as we go through. So, just the map of Asia, we've said Asia is the biggest region for receiving money in the world, and it's driven by migrants. So these are the top 10 migrant sending countries in Asia. I think most of you know this, understandably dominated by India and China, but a number of others, Kazakhstan being there. Philippines, where we are now, as you correctly said, remittances account for about 10% of GDP, and one of the major senders or one of the major migrating countries in the region or the world. I don't think we need to look at that much more, but which countries in this region actually receive a lot of migrants? Australia, understandably, I think pretty obviously, but India, Kazakhstan, Thailand, Malaysia, and so on. Now, again, I would keep saying these are official numbers. Those are the only numbers we've got. And, of course, there's a lot of unofficial data and everything as well. So whilst I'm going to cover quite a lot of numbers, you should all be questioning whether they are realistic from your own practical experience, and what can we do to make the numbers more accurate. So if you look in terms of the flows of remittances, to the region, you can see that East Asia and the Pacific accounted for 143 billion last year, which made it the single biggest region in the world, closely followed by South Asia at 132 billion. So out of the 526 billion going to low and middle income countries, this region accounts for by far the largest flow. And within that, one of the interesting and maybe more disturbing trends that we're seeing is that whilst remittances have grown reasonably steadily, the actual measured flows are likely to decrease this year as we go forward. Not significantly in some cases, but to some parts of the world they will, particularly driven by challenges in the Gulf countries in terms of accepting migrants, increased barriers put up by those countries to how many migrants can come in and for what purposes, and also driven by other sort of macroeconomic effects. But generally speaking, most industries will be happy with a 5% or so growth, and that's what we're seeing in remittances. Now, I think many of you might have seen this type of slide. To put remittances in its perspective or context globally, remittances are now the largest form of external finance for most developing countries. And if you take out China from the foreign direct investment side, then remittances is definitely the largest flow. If you look at the chart, the red line which shows remittances shows a pretty steady growth. And one of the key factors around remittances is not only the size, which is 4 times the size of international overseas development assistance, but is also the fact that remittances are particularly reliable when other forms of financing are poor. So remittances are quite often counter-cyclical. Many of you will have seen that if there is some sort of crisis, whether it's a geographical crisis or a political crisis, particularly geographies, geographical crisis, often remittances are the first form of finance that comes back in to help that country, and the money sent by citizens of those countries overseas tends to be much more predictable and reliable than any other form of financing. So if we now look at globally again, who are the top receiving countries? Well, you can see, as I said, India 82.2, so I was roughly right earlier, and China, and then Philippines and Mexico seem to have a bit of a competition for third place, depending on various factors each year, but also Pakistan, Bangladesh and Vietnam from these regions. Interestingly, the Mexico number, for instance, that's virtually 97-98% of money to Mexico comes from the US, whereas most of these other countries are receiving money from a number of different countries around the world. The right-hand slide, as you look at it, shows the percentage of GDP, so you were right with Tonga before, but if you look at the countries down there, Tonga, Haiti, Nepal, Tajikistan, Kyrgyz Republic and so on, you'll notice that most of those are relatively small countries in population terms. But it does show there are a lot of countries out there that are highly dependent on remittances, but sometimes it's quite hard to actually formalise a lot of them or capitalise on them. In terms of, and apologies if you can't read these numbers at the back, in terms of the top 10 receiving countries in this region, and I think the key thing is that Asia Pacific is predominantly a receive region, then India, Philippines, most of those we talked about before, you'll see are on there, with India being the largest, not surprisingly, and then China after that. Outbound remittances, though, are important for some of the countries here. Republic of Korea being one, Malaysia, where it has really grown over the last few years, being another, and obviously Australia and Japan and so on, also being quite large sending countries. where do the transactions into the region come from? And this is a subset of the overall region. So this is the 12 largest countries, or the Colombo Process member states, for those of you who are familiar with that group. And this shows more of a mixed picture. So interestingly, the US is the largest single country for sending money into Asia. But actually, if you look at the Gulf states as a whole, then they're significantly more than that. So you come to over 35%. So really, the US and the Gulf states are dominating. And then you've got a lot of other states where there are smaller levels, but nonetheless quite important. So I mentioned about cost before, and how the costs are sort of roughly in line with the global targets. You'll see that there's a red line, which is the Sustainable Development Goal 10.C. How many of you are familiar with that? No. Okay, good. Well, I've got a slide on that later, so we can cover that. But basically, it's a global target. And what that's really showing is that in all the regions of the world, the current price level for remittances is significantly ahead of any of the global targets on remittance pricing that have been introduced by governments that are out there. I think if you look at money transfers in the region, there are mixed ways that money is sent. So there's a lot of formal services. Many of you, I'm sure, just driving from here to the airport, those of you who flew in like me, you see lots of Western Union and MoneyGram and all the money transfer company signs out there. So that's a traditional cash-to-cash based service, which is very strong and probably accounts for about 90% of remittances around the world. But what we are seeing is the recent rise of more digital transactions. So in the sending countries, that's often now taking place either on your mobile phone or on the internet through some sort of website. And there you've got companies such as WorldRemit, Azimo, Zoom, Remitly, some of these names that you'd be quite familiar with. But we're also seeing a number of mobile-to-mobile based services. So typically you would see, I think 10, 11, 12 years ago, we had Smart Telecom here. We're already able to send money digitally from Hong Kong, for instance, into the Philippines. But of course, most people tend to think more about this being a market that's traditionally been focused on Africa, particularly with the M-Pesa type of service. But that's changing quite a bit. Interestingly, on my journey in from the airport last night, I was talking to my taxi driver, who he asked me what I was doing, like all good taxi drivers do. So I explained I was here to talk about money transfers, and then he said he was just back from Oman. He'd spent the last 2 years there. And then he was saying, I said, so what would you like to do to improve it? So he said, oh, I'd really like to be able to do it on my phone, and so on. And this was a guy who actually is the same age as me, so he's not a young guy, but that was what he was wanting to do, and he wasn't aware whether you could or couldn't do it here in the Philippines, for instance. There's definitely much more awareness and interest there. Then we've got, obviously, the development of cryptocurrencies, which, again, Asia is leading the way on the use of those for settlement, as a settlement tool, basically, to help the process for money transfer operators, but also ELT and those types of things to help with the regulatory and compliance side of remittances, which are particularly important and are quite difficult to tackle. I talked earlier about informal remittances. Here's a slide that sort of shows how in some markets informal remittances are extremely important or believed to be, and in others not quite so. Now the challenge with this, of course, is it's almost impossible to get any data on informal remittances. So these are based on a number of assumptions which we can talk about at another time. But you'll see that in all of the markets, informal remittances are high, and in some markets they're probably nearly as high as the formal ones. And again, we'll talk in a bit about why that's important. So just to summarise these sort of massive slides and charts, we talked about Asia being a big region. I won't go over that, except it deserves a lot of attention and quite often doesn't get as much as some of the other regions. Multiple countries mean there are over 6,000 individual corridors, so that's sending between different country A to country B would be a corridor. So if you've got 6,000 of those and you're trying to run a money transfer business, that's 6,000 individual different markets that you've got to actually manage, get your pricing right, get your promotion right, get your regulatory position right, and so on. So it can be quite complex. We reckon there's over 1 million payout locations within the region, and about 850 million individual transactions being moved, which at a combined level cost probably around about $18 billion in fees that are being paid by consumers. So it's one of the areas that has attracted a lot of attention for innovation, see how the price can come down to spread that money more between the sender and the receiver. And as I just said earlier, the cash side is definitely the dominant method in this region, but there are other methods that are equally as important or becoming more important. Account to account is actually becoming more important here in Asia. Many of you would have seen some quite exciting projects or services being launched, particularly say from Malaysia or Singapore to accounts. And also the whole mobile side is starting to pick up. So I'm going to pause there to have a drink of water, but also, are there any questions, views, bits, other things you'd like to know? Right, let's give you a microphone. Yeah, thanks very much.